Hi, this is Sean Hafer, and in this tutorial, we'll be looking at the basics of 3D layers in After Effects. So let's start off with a new composition, and I'm going to name it 3D. We'll do a 1280 by 720, 2997 is fine, and 5 seconds is where I've got mine set at. And I'll hit OK. So now we've got a new comp. Let's go ahead and create some text. So do a new text layer here with 3D. And I'll highlight that. And let's maybe make it, I don't know, 150. I'm using Universe Black Extended. Use any font you want. And that seems fine. I'm going to go into my paragraph settings here and make sure it's centered. And we've got it aligned centered. And then go back up here. That seems fine. And go maybe a little bit of a bluer blue. And then real quick, go to my Align tab, align horizontally and align vertically. So it's right in the center. So when we look at this, we can see that our anchor point is right here, and we're centered, that anchor point is centered in our comp. So if I come over here and we look at our position, we can see we've got our X and Y. So X is our side to side, and Y is our up and down. I just undid those two. To create a 3D layer out of this, we come over here to this checkbox under the little cube, and we check that, and that will create a 3D layer. Now you'll see a few things happen immediately. I'll just scroll in a little here. We get this new sort of gizmo, right, of our axis that we can use to manipulate it. We also have some new options in our viewport. So we've got Classic 3D, and if we pull that down, we also have Cinema 4D. Make sure you're on Classic 3D for this part, so Classic 3D. Then over here we can see in position we've got X, Y, and now we have Z. And if we scrub that Z, you can see it's moving away from us. It looks like it's scaling. It's actually moving towards and away from us. So I'm going to set that back to 0. And we also see now on our rotation, we've got our X and Y, but then we also have a new one called orientation. So there we've got an X rotation, right? So from our anchor point, rotating forward and back. We've got our Y rotation along the Y, so that would be spinning around. And then we have a Z rotation, which would be orbiting sort of around that Z axis, or rotating that way. So I'm going to go ahead and zero those out. Now before we move forward, let's talk a little bit about our render engines. So if you see under here, we also have this geometry options that appeared and material options. Now, if I come here and hit change renderer, I am going to look up here 3D renderer, and we're in classic 3D. And basically what that is, it is a 2.5D. So we're moving 2D planes or 2D shapes, so they don't have any depth, in 3D space. So we can move them forward and back and rotate them, but they won't have any depth to them. Now, if we use the Cinema 4D renderer, we can actually create some depth, but there's a lot of restrictions. So you'll see here, you can read these, the enabled things of what we can do, but disabled are some of the big ones are blending modes, track mats, layer styles, certain masks. So it's up to you, but let's change this to Cinema 4D and I'll show you the big benefit of it. So you might want to utilize this for certain aspects, or maybe for certain projects, but on others use the standard classic After Effects 3D. So with the 3D in the Cinema 4D level, you can see it changed down here. What we can do, let me select this, and I'm going to rotate a little. Let's take that orientation on the Y, and I'll rotate it to maybe about a 322. That looks good. Now what we can see here under geometry options, we have a bevel style, and we also have an extrusion depth. So an extrusion, or to extrude, is when you take a shape and you push it out in one direction from that shape. So if you think about a toothpaste tube, and at the end of that toothpaste tube, you've got that round circle, that hole. As you squeeze the tube, it comes out in a cylinder. So if we take this extrusion depth and start cranking that up, you can see we get depth out of it. Now, this looks a bit like a mess here, and that's because we don't have any lighting happening right now. So everything is super flat. So if I come up here to layer, new, light, and we'll just leave this at the default point light, point color is white, fine, and we'll hit OK. Now you can see it's created a light for us, and we can see that 3D depth happening. And if we move this light around by grabbing its gizmo, you can see we've got that 3D molded text. Now we also can come in here. Now we can see that extrusion a little better, that thickness, right? And we can also add a bevel. So if we come up here and maybe add a concave bevel, you can see we've got that bevel all around there. And then we've got things as far as the bevel depth as well. But you can see that starts to really affect the size of your text. So it's something that's interesting, but you can play around with that. All right, but for this tutorial mainly, we are going to be in our classic 3D rendering engine. So I'm going to come over here. Instead of Cinema 4D, I'm going to go to Classic 3D, and now we're back to our little plane. So when we're working in 3D space, this camera view, it can be a little difficult to maneuver and see what we're doing. So I like to work in at least two views. And the way we can do that is to come over to this bottom right corner here and go to two views. And now you can see we've got a top view over here, and we've got our active camera view here. And the top view here, we can change that. So if we click in here, when you see those little arrows around the box, you know that's the selected view. And then we can come in here and maybe we could look at a right view, or we could look at the bottom view. Okay, so we can get all of those different looks there. But I'm going to keep this one on top. And then we've got our light, so we can see our light is out here. We can move that around. It is moving and illuminating. And same thing with our object here, right? We can move that around. See, as it comes closer to the light, it gets more light, then goes away. Okay. Let's create a background so we can kind of see what we can do here. So if we go up to Layer, New Solid, and we'll call it Background. And just pick a color. I'm just going to make it an off-white. Somewhere a little warm. Okay, that seems fine. And then make comp size just to be safe and hit OK. Now, what happens when it's still a 2D layer? It just overrides every view and it's the comp, right? So we're not going to get our 3D effects as a 2D layer. So what we have to do is come up, click on this one to make it a 3D layer as well. And now we can come down here, set it, and I'm just going to lock it. Move it to the bottom and lock it. Now you can see we start to get this little vignette. And as we move our light further away, it spreads out more. We move closer. So again, this might be a way you might want to do some interesting effects instead of using a gradient ramp. All right, now we've got this 3D. I'm going to go ahead and select my 3D again. And let's get that orientation back to 0. All right, so we've got that. And if we look here, we're not getting a shadow. You would think we'd get a shadow because our light, if we come to our light options, point light 1, light options, we can see it is casting a shadow. It's on. The thing is, you have to tell objects to cast the shadow themselves. So if we come down to our text layer, 3D, and our material options, we've got cast shadows, and by default, that's off. Now when we turn that on, we can now see we've got a shadow cast. And if we move this further away, it's a larger shadow. If we move it side to side, we'll get that shadow moving in relationship to the light, right? So you can create some really cool effects that way. I'm just going to move it back a little bit here. Now in the shadow options here, if we go back to our light, we have shadow darkness. So we could bring that down if you wanted a softer shadow, just a lighter shadow. And then we also have shadow diffusion to give more of the illusion of maybe a soft box or a softer light source, right? So you can play with those two options to get the shadow you really want. So I'm going to do a little bit of a soft shadow and shadow darkness down a little bit. Okay. And so if you were doing something with, say, cut paper, and you wanted this to look like it was, just laying on the ground, you could always just zoom in here and move this really close, right? And it would give us that illusion of a little bit of difference, and then if the light moved or if it moved, side to side, that shadow would change a little bit with the light. And you'd really feel like that's cut paper on there. So let's duplicate this layer by hitting Control or Command D. And we'll go into here. Let's go to our character on that new one. Let's pick a new color for that. Maybe like a light green. And let's just position that. Now, one thing, you don't want things on exactly the same layer if they're going to pass in front or behind each other. So I'll nestle that right in the middle there and maybe give it a little rotation. So let's rotate it on the Z and maybe move it down a little bit. So again, we've got a really nice look of, some pseudo 3D objects, sort of a cut paper vibe, laying in space. Again, you can animate these any way you want. You can animate the light. We could set our light up, again, further away, closer in. That really starts to accentuate that vibe there. Yeah, so we can see that. So some really cool effects we can create. Now, the other thing, we talked about the light types when we first created the light. So let's look at those options. So in the light options, now a point light is basically like a light bulb hanging in a room. So light is just emitting from all directions out from a center point. If we go to a spotlight, that is more like a flashlight, right? So if we move this light in a little, we can see that spotlight effect happens. So if we were moving this side to side or forward and back, we can definitely get that sort of mysterious vibe, right? So if I was moving it along, we could discover the 3D type and then go on our way. And then we've got options in here as far as the cone angle. So that's our cone, right? So we can feather it and go in here. And the same thing, the feather is again that softness of how much a really sharp light or a really soft light. And you can adjust that as well. And all of these can be animated as well, all of that type of thing. There also is ambient light, which is just a flat light, okay? And then we also have a parallel light, which is basically just all the rays are going to be parallel to each other. So there's no variation as they spread out. It's basically like the sun, because the sun is so far away that the rays that hit us, even though it is a point light theoretically, the rays that hit us are all basically such a small segment of those angles that are spreading out that they're theoretically parallel. But I'm going to go back to my point light. And we've got our shadows here. We've got our point light in space. Maybe I'll move it out just a little bit. So I've got a little bit of vignette. Got my shadow. All right, now let's add another character to this scene, and we're going to import this little bat. And double click here to import, or Command I, Control I. And this is a bat I found. I was on I think it's the Museum of London website, and they have a lot of copyright-free images. And I found this bat, and I took it into Photoshop, and I cut it out. So we're going to use that today. So let's go ahead and bring this in, drop it in, And this bat is huge. So on my bat PSD, first off, let's make it a 3D layer. Doot. And we can roll down here and let's scale it down. Our transform, we'll scale it to, say, 15%. That looks good. And now we'll scroll in here a little bit. Let's pull our bat out. Again, the bat selected. I can either come here to my position XYZ, and I want to move it out. And maybe I want to move it up a little. Okay, so we'll be here. That looks good. So what we're going to do, let's have this bat fly in from here and fly out, and we'll have it kind of swoop in. So I'm going to start out a little further away towards the camera. And so maybe in our Z, I'll move them over off screen. So let's say 1500, 400, and negative 300. Okay, so that looks good. I'm going to set a position keyframe, make sure I hit home first, make sure my playhead is at the beginning, set a position keyframe, and then we'll move forward to 1 second. And let's bring it in. We'll move forward to 2 seconds and bring it back out. Okay, so now I'm going to select my first and last keyframe, and we'll do an easy ease. So you can just hit F9 or right click, keyframe assistant, easy ease. So that'll give us a little ease in and out. And let's hit play and see what this looks like. All right, now that's pretty bad. So let's go ahead and see what we can do to improve this. Well, first off, we don't have a shadow. So remember to create that shadow, come into your bat, material options, and turn on cast shadows. Great, now we've got that shadow coming from our bat. Let's also roll out here a little. Now we've got our motion path staying just in its one plane, right? Its Z depth doesn't change at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to my first bit of the motion path, select that, and pull that out a little bit. And then I'll select this one, pull it out a little bit. And maybe let's take our middle one. Let me get this out of the way. Let's bring that even in a little bit. So it really is diving down. And let's see how that looks. So we've got it coming in. There it's diving down and then flying back out. So it adds a little more dynamism with the shadow getting close and far away. Okay, and we could tweak this a little bit if we wanted to curve that out some with our Bezier handles. Right, so there's something like that. Okay, and the last thing is our bat looks like it's kind of crazy, right? It's just not moving along its flight path. Now, what we can do to get that to work is if we select our bat layer, if we right click, go up to transform, and there's auto orient. If we click on auto orient, we want to orient along the path and hit OK. Now, since we're in 3D space, it oriented to it, but it's flipped it for us. So all we have to do is come down to our orientation, click on our Y, and roll that forward to 90 degrees, or just type in 90. Okay, so now if we scrub it, we can see it's coming along. Now it's not quite pointed the exact way, right? So I'm going to go ahead and on my X, just rotate him a little bit so it looks like his head's pointing the way he's flying. And that's just the nature of the way that was in Photoshop. Okay, so now if I come back, we can go back to one view. And let's see how this looks. All right, so there we've got our bat. And one more thing we could do, we could throw a little motion blur on the bat if we want. So if we come up to our bat again, right here, these 3-4 dots together, that's our motion blur. We can turn that on. So let's again take a quick render, see what we get. And there we go. We've got our bat zooming in, our shadow being really dynamic over our two little cutout pieces of paper. But what if we wanted to just see the shadow? What if we didn't want to see the bat as if it's flying in front of the light, but not in our field of vision to give that sort of ominous, just shadow mode? That's easy to do. If we come over to our material options on our bat, we've got our cast shadows on. So again, we can go to only. So on cast shadows, we've got on, then we also have only. So that will cast just the shadow. Now if we come back, we see the shadow start out, comes in, and then comes back out. So that's how you would do just a cast shadow. So I'll do another tutorial on dealing with some cameras and depth of field next, but hopefully this helped you out, and thanks for watching.